Good morning. Welcome back. This is Geography 10, Lecture 16. Couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, I left for Washington last week without remembering to post the slides for the map quiz that was going to be this week. And then I forgot about it. And a couple of you reminded me, and GSIs reminded me, and so it wasn't until Friday that I actually realized this mistake. So we got the map quiz items and map posted, but decided that since it was Friday already, that we shouldn't have the map quiz this week after all. I believe you got an email about this. So we will have the map quiz for South and Southeast Asia next week in sections. There was going to be another map quiz next week. And because it didn't seem fair to have two map quizzes in the same week, we are not going to do that. And as a result, we will put the map quiz that would have been next week into the final exam instead. But that's not all that big a change because there were already going to be map quiz components to the final exam. Next week is the last week of section, just so that you don't overlook that fact. Today we're going to talk about globalization, neoliberalism, and development. These are topics that are directly relevant to the movies that you watched in lecture last week. And I guess I'm open to either scenario. I can either do the lecture and talk about the movies at the end, or talk about the movies as we go along, or we could start with a discussion of the movies and then move our way into the lecture. Any preferences? Pardon? As we go along. Okay. All right, I think we can do it that way then. Are there any other questions about anything? Did you all enjoy for me it felt sort of like a week off, but it wasn't because I was at a conference. Did it feel like a week off for you? With movies and so forth? Everyone get a chance to catch up on the reading? Sort of. All right. Course update. For last Thursday, even though I wasn't here and you watched a movie, I was expecting you to read the chapter from Resurrecting Empire by Rashid Khalidi, which I discussed in the lecture just before I left, and also the section from The Soccer War by Ryszard Kapuscinski. For today, I wanted you to have read a chapter from another one of Kapuscinski's books, this one called We're Closing Down the City. What's going on here? Oh, I got the slides mixed up. The point here is that you are to finish Planet of Slums, all of it, chapters 4, 5, 6, and the epilogue, by the end of this week. And in the next lecture, I will be talking about that. Okay? Next Tuesday, we're going to watch our final movie of the semester about China. And for Thursday of next week, I'd like you to read chapter 4 of Delaney, which is about Israel-Palestine. And I'll be discussing that in the lecture on the 29th, which is the last lecture of the semester. Any questions about that? The map quiz is next week, as I said. South Asia and Southeast Asia movie, Frontline Tank Man on the 27th. I don't know if it's in this one or the next one. Yes, okay. The final exam, we got the location for it, so I thought I would announce that. The final is Wednesday, May 12th at 11:30, and it will happen in 155 Dwinell, not in this room. I need to do a little research, figure out how many chairs are in 155 Dwinell. We will make arrangements for an alternative location for DSP students, and I may again need to ask for volunteers to take the exam at that location if there aren't enough chairs in 155 Dwinell. Is anybody familiar with that room? Is it huge? It's huge? Okay, good. All right. Any questions about any of that? All right. So, what is globalization? Without skipping ahead and looking at the next slides, off the top of your heads, if you had to answer that question, what would you say? What is it? Yeah.
Like the existence of institutions that go beyond borders and affect like places that aren't necessarily where they're stationed.
Okay, the existence of institutions that transcend national boundaries. And what was the last part?
No, that sounds better than
The emphasis then would be on institutions.
Well, so like physical institutions, also like ideology, just like the idea that borders aren't necessarily containing ideas inside one place that are able to transfer.
Okay, the idea that ideas can move across national boundaries. Of course, I mean, one could say that was true before. Or maybe another question is, when did this start? When is the beginning of globalization? Was it when you were born? Is one of you responsible? Was it before you were born? Any ideas? Yeah. I'm sorry? Okay, world wars as a starting point for this. Which one? Okay, World War II. Yeah. Michael Jordan and the what? And the New Global Capitalism. And who's this by? Walter Weber? Lefebvre. Something like that. Okay. Okay, he says it starts in the 1970s with the advent of certain kinds of communication technology. Presumably computer-oriented, or any other thoughts about when this started? We've got a number of candidates now. Okay, I guess we skip ahead to the slides now. I mean, this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, right? You've probably heard this term plenty. It doesn't often get defined very clearly. It's sometimes unclear what it means. According to the Dictionary of Human Geography, which struck me as good a place as any to start, it's derived from a term, global village, which is associated with a social theorist by the name of Marshall McLuhan, who dubbed this term, coined this term, to refer to the effects of new communication technologies on social and cultural life. So that would put it somewhere with the advent of computer technology and the movement of information in sort of digital form. It says social, cultural, political, and economic processes now operate at a global scale with a consequent reduction in the significance of other geographical scales, national, local, etc. Now, I mean, we've already seen, right, that economic processes and political processes clearly were already operating at a global scale for quite some time. So we're not talking here just about trade, for example. Global trade, or at least international trade, is very old. And colonialism, imperialism are examples of political processes that also clearly operate at a scale beyond the nation state. Social and cultural processes, perhaps we could think about those as having some kind of new fluidity across boundaries that was not there before. But clearly, immigration, which is also significantly older than globalization, would be an instance of social and cultural processes operating at scales larger than the nation state. And we're going to need to try to distinguish between international and global, right? Perhaps they seem the same. The idea that something goes across international borders might seem the same thing as global, but in a sense it's not. International keeps the focus on the nation state and simply says there are processes going on between them. Global suggests that maybe the nation state is no longer the fundamental unit for these processes, no longer somehow grounding them. The processes have kind of moved to a scale that is in fact partially independent of, or makes the nation state no longer quite so important, that kind of thing. And here are some examples, maps from the atlas and a graph. Let's start down here in the lower right. Volume of world merchandise exports on a logarithmic scale, okay? So this is 100, this is 1,000. If you went up another level here, you would be talking about 1 million, something like that. So just using 100 as a baseline, in 1950, you see agricultural products have increased perhaps 8, 9-fold, something like that. This is the amount of merchandise that is exported, right, rather than consumed within the boundaries of the nation state where it is produced. And you can see that agricultural products have increased significantly. Mining products have gone up even more. But manufactured products have dwarfed both agricultural and mining products in their movement across international boundaries. So that's one way of thinking about this in terms of economic processes. How much of what is produced in any given country in the world is produced in order that it can be sent to some other country for sale or consumption, right? These maps depict this one here, the internet explosion. It says with more than 1 billion users worldwide, the internet is a powerful, if unequally distributed, form of global communication. The U.S. leads in internet usage with about 1/5 of all users. In 2005, China displaced Japan for the second highest number of users, but the 100 million, whoa, what does that say? Anybody have their atlas with them? Pardon? Fewer? Chinese. 100 million Chinese users represent less than 10% of the country's population. These are internet users in blocks, and you can see that North America has a significantly larger share than most of the rest of the world. This map does not blow up very well. This one is the density of underground and undersea fiber optic cables. So you can see that the number of fiber optic cables connecting North America to Europe is extremely large. There's a great density of them. There are fewer connecting the rest of the world. Africa has many fewer connecting it to South America, for example, to Australia. There's a great density of them across the Pacific between North America and Asia. How many of you were aware that these cables existed down there underneath the ocean? Or did you think this all moved just by magic? Magic, yeah, I thought it was magic too. No, there has to be cables. There have to be physical fiber optic cables connecting these countries, these continents. And they are laid down in the ocean, obviously at great expense. And they are absolutely critically necessary to the movement of all this digital information between continents. So this is all to give you a sense of the kinds of things that contribute to or make up this concept of globalization. Perhaps this is a good time to talk about the movies. What do you see in those movies from last week that might serve to illustrate some of these points? You remember the movies, right? Just last week? A long time ago, I realize. Yeah.
There were companies that were using foreign labor for their products.
Okay. Both movies are about, in part at least, the use of laborers in one country, Jamaica in one case, Mexico in the other, to produce goods for companies based in other countries. And in both cases, in fact, what we have are designated spaces, territories carved out of these host countries, Jamaica and Mexico, where the rules are different, so to speak, about the use of labor, the presence of foreign companies, the kinds of treatment those countries receive in terms of taxes or the sort of jurisdiction of various kinds of laws that they cope with or deal with, provided that they locate in those spaces. So that's very much about international economic production, economic processes. Anything else come to mind about the movies? Yeah.
There was the World Trade Organization and the way that there's a global method to like determine how things are sold.
Okay. This is a major part of Life and Debt, the discussion about the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which is an institution dedicated to, or for the purpose of, setting and enforcing rules for trade between countries. Any other thoughts? So would you say these movies are about globalization? Yeah.
They're about the negative consequences that some nations get from globalization.
Okay, they're about the negative consequences that are experienced by some nations or some people within those nations of globalization. What were some of the examples of that in the case of Jamaica? Yeah. Okay. A lot of that movie is about agricultural production, not just milk, but other things. What happens in Jamaica to agricultural production under, yeah? Okay. It becomes difficult, impossible for local agricultural producers to compete even in their own domestic marketplace, right? They are under the new rules, and these are rules that the WTO promulgates. The market for agricultural products is opened up, meaning that anybody from anywhere else, or from at least other places, can send their agricultural goods into Jamaica and sell them for whatever price they wish. And if they can produce those goods at a lower price than the local farmers can do, then the local farmers find themselves unable to make a profit. In order to sell their goods, they have to lower their prices below the cost of production, and they are at a distinct disadvantage. Why do you suppose that might be? How could it possibly be that you could produce something far away and pay all the costs of shipping it and still be able to sell it for less than somebody who grew the same thing locally? Yeah. Okay, part of it could be subsidies provided by the countries where the goods are produced that enable farmers there to sell their goods at a lower price and still make a profit. What else? Yeah. Okay, economies of scale. It may be that the producers elsewhere are producing on vastly larger scales than the local farmers, and this enables them to lower their per unit costs and makes it possible for them to outcompete smaller producers, even including the cost of transportation. Here's another way of thinking about globalization, another aspect of these relationships between countries. This is world debt. It says debt hinders many developing countries. The World Bank classifies countries by debt level. A country with debt at or above 80% of its gross national income is classified as severely indebted and in danger of defaulting on loans. And so here we see estimated external debt as a percentage of GDP at purchasing power parity 2002 to 2004 estimates. Purchasing power parity is a way of adjusting currency measurements to account for different costs of living in different places. And so we see that countries in Africa frequently range from more than 100% to 30% or more. Virtually all of them are at least somewhat indebted. Most of the world is at least somewhat indebted, but some countries much more so than others. This would mean that the amount owed to foreign creditors, for countries of the darkest color here, is greater than the total amount produced in any given year by that economy. So you would owe essentially more than an entire year's income in debt to foreign entities. And what these entities are is an interesting question. We'll try to get into that a little bit further, particularly when we get to Davis again. Now, opinions about globalization vary a lot, and it's important to recognize the ways in which these debates get framed and the kinds of underlying assumptions that frequently inform different people's perspectives on globalization. So again, from the Dictionary of Human Geography, quote, "The view of globalization as an inexorable and virtually unstoppable force which can only be accommodated rather than resisted has become the conventional wisdom in neoliberal political and business circles and employed as a rhetoric to justify particular kinds of decisions." We'll talk in a moment about what neoliberal means. For now, the present point is simply that you will find certain people describing globalization as essentially something that is, so to speak, natural, or at least beyond anyone's control. It just is what is happening in the world. It has to be accepted and lived with, right? We can't possibly stop it, so you may as well come to terms with it and recognize it for what it is, which is simply the way the world is going. And if you pressed these people to explain why, they would probably, in many cases, revert to a kind of technocratic or technological determinism. They would say, look, these computers exist. They make production more efficient. They are getting more and more powerful, faster and faster all the time. These efficiencies that they allow are such that you really can't slow them down. And if everybody in the world has an incentive to use them, and if the technology is evolving that quickly, and there's lots of money to be made in it, how do you expect to stop it? Why would you try to stop it, right? It creates such incredible productive capacity. It's a good thing. And it can't really be, there's no sense in fighting it. And that's a position that you will commonly encounter. Now, obviously, the movies do a nice job of suggesting that it's not quite that simple, right? If you enable greater efficiency in production, sure. But what about the people whose livelihoods, say small farmers in places like Jamaica, are undermined by that gain in efficiency in other locations, right? Are they all supposed to somehow come up with the kinds of production technologies that are found in other parts of the world overnight? What if they can't afford it? Similarly, with the maquila workers along the border with Mexico, they don't appear to be making out terribly well from the circumstances that are created by globalization. So the author of this entry in the Dictionary of Human Geography goes on to say, there are strong opponents who argue, in effect, that globalization is a mirage, or at the very least, nothing new. So one counterposition holds that globalization isn't new. International trade spanning the globe goes back hundreds of years. This is a kind of fetish. People are calling this thing globalization and trying, by using that term, to make it seem novel, to make it seem somehow qualitatively different, to try to help justify the idea that this is something we should celebrate, or at least we shouldn't resist. But in fact, this is all just a figment of their imaginations. They're dressing it up as something super special and different, celebrating it with pictures of the globe and rhetoric about progress and technology. But in fact, it's nothing new. Well, the author of this entry says, in fact, neither of these extreme positions can be justified. Globalization processes are qualitatively different from internationalization processes. And this gets back to the point I was making a moment ago, that if you talk about internationalization, you're still suggesting that the nation state is the key location, the key institution, the key sort of framework. And all you're really saying is that there are interactions between these nation states. Globalization is, by this argument, actually qualitatively different from that. It's no longer just about relations between nation states. It's actually something different. Any thought, like how you might illustrate that? Maybe drawing on the movies? Yeah.
Well, in the movie on the factory workers, the companies were given sweet benefits by the government.
Uh-huh.
So it's not between countries, it's between a company and the Mexican government.
Okay, excellent point. In the case of the maquilas, the relationship isn't so much between the United States and Mexico, although the United States and Mexico had to come to some kind of general agreement about creating this maquila zone along the border. It's actually a relationship between a company, or lots of companies, based in the United States, and workers in a particular place. They happen to be in another country. In this case, it's Mexico. In the other movie, it's Jamaica. But if you look at that decision about where to have a factory, it's not made by a government. It's made by a firm. And if you think about the firm's decision-making process, what are they thinking about? What are they evaluating? They're looking at the maquila zone in Mexico, or they're looking at the special production zone in Jamaica. But they're probably also comparing those places to similar locations elsewhere on the globe, right? They're not saying, oh, well, let's go invest in Mexico. They're saying, let's go find a place where we can find the most favorable terms of labor relations, costs of labor, conditions of labor, laws about unions, perhaps, working conditions, and also other considerations, taxes, tariffs, you name it. And in fact, if it turns out that they can produce their good more cheaply in some other location, they might very well pull out and move. And they will move to another spot that will probably be in still another country, but it will not be strongly determined by questions of which nation it happens to be in, right? The national location is sort of contingent, and other considerations are of greater importance. And that freedom to relocate at will without respect to national boundaries is, by this argument, qualitatively different from what was the case in the past. Other questions? It must be emphasized, however, that change does not occur everywhere in the same way and at the same rate. The processes of globalization are not geographically uniform. Hence, globalization should be conceptualized as a complex of interrelated processes rather than an end state. Such tendencies are highly uneven in time and space. So here's another cautionary note about globalization. You should not look at it, think about it, as something that just has arrived and it's done. It's not, there's no way of sort of pinpointing it and saying, aha, now we're in a global age, everything's sort of fixed, settled. In fact, the effects of this are extremely uneven and continue to be debated and battled about on an ongoing basis. Anybody who follows World Trade Organization negotiations, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade has been going on and on and on and on and on. They meet periodically. They always say that they're, on the brink of some great breakthrough, but frequently the talks break down, and there are countless exceptions, special considerations, unevennesses in this process of globalization. One of the biggest battles being about agricultural subsidies, right? The ways in which the United States and many European countries continue to subsidize their farmers even though the rules of the WTO would say that that's not allowed anymore. And there's plenty of lingering sort of protectionist impulses informing these kinds of debates and difficulties. Okay, now, let's turn to neoliberalism. This is another term that you probably encountered. It's already come up in one of the slides here today. It's an extremely slippery term or concept. Anybody confused about why neoliberalism frequently seems like conservatism? Or rather, well, there's neoliberalism, there's also neoconservatism, right? And one of the weird things about these two terms is that they seem frequently to have the same content or very similar content. Any ideas why that would be? I mean, these are supposed to be opposites, right? Liberal, conservative, we consider them to be politically opposed most of the time. Why should adding N-E-O to the beginning of them somehow make them the same? Anyone know? Yeah. Okay, exactly. At its origins, and over its history in the last, say, 200 to 300 years, liberalism was associated with freedom of the market. It wasn't only about freedom of the market, but it was very much about freedom of the market. Adam Smith is a classic proponent of classic liberalism, and it included the idea that people should be free to produce the things they want, work for whomever they want, sell their labor. It included the idea that everyone is fundamentally equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of shopping or whatever, right? So it was a political philosophy as well, but in the economic realm, liberalism in its classical expressions was also about economic freedom. You remember Marx's line about Bentham, right? Utilitarianism. Those were ideas that were very, very central to liberalism. In the course of the 20th century, liberalism took on a different connotation in the United States and in much of Europe as well, associated with a stronger role for government, programs to sort of shore up the inequalities created by the market, things like Social Security, welfare, even public education, a heavy or strong or important role for the government came to be associated with liberalism, and that's why we now need, or the folks who espouse neoliberalism call it neoliberalism, because they're in fact turning away from that more Keynesian 20th century welfare state notion of liberalism and re-articulating a philosophy grounded in economic free trade, freedom of the marketplace, that sort of more classically Adam Smithian and, well, there's a whole bunch of other figures in the 20th century who inspire this. And it happens that those positions are positions that, again, in the course of the 20th century came to be associated with conservatism in the United States, hence the possibility that these two terms can come to resemble each other. Is that clear enough for present purposes? All right. To get at this question of neoliberalism, I'm drawing heavily on a book by David Harvey called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. He writes there, neoliberalism is, in the first instance, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. So that's fairly straightforward summation of what we've just been discussing. He goes on. It holds that the social good will be maximized by maximizing the reach and frequency of market transactions, and it seeks to bring all human action into the domain of the market. This requires technologies of information creation and capacities to accumulate, store, transfer, analyze, and use massive databases to guide decisions in the global marketplace. So here we see the link to globalization articulated very much in terms of technology, but not technology just in the sense of new tools or new machines that can do things. Here it's linked to a specific purpose. What Harvey is pointing out is that in order for a global market to work, requires an incredible amount of information. And this is information that can only be effectively used for this purpose if it has a certain technological platform on which to operate. So if you put yourself, again, in the position of that firm deciding where to locate its factory, should we locate it in Mexico? Should we locate it in Jamaica? Should we put it in the Philippines instead? That firm can't make those decisions without reliable information about all of those different locations. It has to be information they can count on. I mean, they're talking about investing millions of dollars, moving all kinds of equipment and employees to different parts of the world. They need to know what the situation is. And they need to be able to predict as best they can what the situation will look like in the future. If we make a widget in the Maquila zone in Mexico and we put $20 million into a factory there, what are the prices of goods going to be? The supply pieces, the inputs, the labor. What are the circumstances for the market for the widgets? What are prices for widgets going to look like there? Where are we going to send them? Who's going to buy them? Harvey's suggesting that in order for there to be such a thing as a free market that functions effectively in the way that markets are supposed to function according to the theory, it has to have, it presupposes an incredible supply of information that has to be accurate, reliable, and you have to be able to actually process it. You have to be able to analyze it. If you just have a huge amount of information sitting around, but you have no way of actually synthesizing it and asking it questions and coming back with answers, and that's all things that are made possible by computers. And you have to have the ability to create new information, move it around. You have to be able to find out what the price of some good is on the other side of the world in effectively real time. And these are things made possible by computers that were really very much more difficult before. We've seen this again in movies. The movement of price signals about coffee between Paris or London or New York and the highlands of Ethiopia. How quickly can that information move? That has strong effects on the kinds of prices that buyers are going to be willing to pay when they purchase coffee beans in Harare. Any questions? Harvey wrote this book at about the time that this book came out in the early stages of the U.S. occupation of Iraq. And he uses Iraq to illustrate what neoliberalism means on the ground, so to speak. What actual policy provisions define neoliberalism. And he draws on the plan that Paul Bremer, who for a time was in charge of the occupation, the plan that Bremer took to Baghdad and announced as the new rules of the game for Iraq. He says this included the full privatization of public enterprises, full ownership ownership rights by foreign firms of Iraqi businesses, full repatriation of foreign profits, the opening of Iraq's banks to foreign control, national treatment for foreign companies, and the elimination of nearly all trade barriers. So, I mean, this didn't get talked about that much during the invasion or the early stages of the occupation. I mean, most of what we heard on the news had to do with, you know, how was the military doing in taking different cities and what were the conditions on the ground as far as the troops and things like that. But Bremer actually showed up and said, these are the new rules. And they had very much to do with the conditions on which international capital would be able to operate in Iraq. So if there were Iraqi nationalized industries, such as, well, oil is the foremost example, but there were plenty of other examples of entire sectors of the economy that were dominated by a national company. Well, they were going to be sold off to private entities, and those private entities might come from anywhere. They could be foreign firms, and those foreign firms would be allowed to repatriate their profits, which is to say, whatever money they made in Iraq, they would be allowed to simply send back home to their headquarters. They were going to be treated, national treatment for foreign companies, they were going to be treated the same way that Iraqi companies would be treated under the law. There would not be different rules for foreign companies as opposed to domestic companies. There would be full ownership rights by foreign firms. In other words, your private property claims on the company you owned in Iraq would be utterly the same from the rules that you might experience at home or the rules that might get imposed on any Iraqi owner. So the idea here was to open up the investment climate or investment environment of Iraq to the rest of the world market. Capital flows would be essentially free and unhindered by the boundaries, the national boundaries of Iraq. Yeah?
So you're saying there could be an Iraqi-owned company that a foreign country could just take ownership of and then take all the money that that company makes?
If there were an Iraqi public, if the Iraqi government, the Iraqi state, owned an industry, it would be privatized, which is to say it would be sold, and the buyer could be from anywhere. If the buyer were Iraqi, an Iraqi consortium or investment and interest, then they would own it and they would operate within Iraq, and no, those profits would stay with that firm and be treated just the same way as the profits of another firm would be treated. However, they would have to buy it in an open auction, so to speak, by the company from the Iraqi state in an open auction that other investors from other countries would be free to participate in as well. So in other words, the price of that firm would be determined by international markets. And if it were bought by a foreign firm, that foreign firm would be free to take its profits and repatriate them back to their home country. Does that make sense?
Say if there was a public enterprise, like what might that be?
Well, how many of you have been to Mexico and bought gasoline? Yes. What's the gas station called? Pemex. Pemex it's Petrol Mexico, translated into Spanish, but it's short for that. The Mexican government owns all the gas stations. And Pemex is the company, the state company that runs that sector of the economy. So that's an illustration of the kind of thing we might be talking about, is a nationalized industry. He says the orders were to apply to all areas of the economy, including public services, the media, manufacturing, services, transportation, finance, and construction. Only oil was exempt. The labor market, on the other hand, was to be strictly regulated. Strikes were effectively forbidden in key sectors, and the right to unionize restricted. Perhaps my example is a poor one. In many parts of the world, including Iraq, the media is also a state-owned enterprise, right? The BBC in the United Kingdom is an example of this. In many countries, all of the media outlets are or were owned by the government. And so these were the kinds of companies that were to be privatized. Oil was exempt precisely for the reasons of history that you find when you read the Khalidi chapter, right? The idea of simply stripping the oil sector from Iraqi control would have been politically impossible and was, to that extent, treated differently. Harvey's point here is to emphasize the disparity between the treatment of the ownership of capital, which was to be privatized and deregulated, versus relations with labor, which were to be brought under a kind of strict regulation that is anything but a kind of free market. Where does neoliberalism come from? He says it's a response to political and economic shocks in the 1970s. And here there is an interesting alignment, temporal alignment, between neoliberalism as a political philosophy or economic philosophy and globalization with its technological basis or emphasis, right? There was a clear political threat, Harvey says, to economic elites and ruling classes everywhere. But beyond this, the economic threat to the position of ruling elites and classes was now becoming palpable. Now, I suppose there aren't that many people in the room who were alive in the 1970s, huh? Just me? Yikes. Anyone else? Okay, David. At least, all right, there's at least one other person. What do you associate with the 1970s in your memories of them, to the extent, well, your notions of what it was like in the 1970s? Any thoughts? Yeah. Okay, there was an oil crisis. That's a very important event from the 70s. Anybody have any images they associate with that? Yeah? How about you? Something else? Long lines at gas stations. Excuse me? Stagflation. And how many of you are familiar with that term? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What does stagflation refer to? It refers to something that was previously considered impossible, but which happened in the 1970s. It was a combination of high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. And I won't go into the macroeconomic theory, but previous to that point, it was believed that these two things would not happen at the same time, that they would counterbalance each other. That if unemployment went up, inflation would go down, the simple reason being that wages would go down and spending by consumers would go down and prices would have to come down because there would be less demand in the marketplace for goods. Well, the 1970s witnessed a period of both very high inflation and very high unemployment at the same time. And this threw the economists back on their heels and forced them to try to reevaluate the macroeconomics of the world market, well, and national economies as well. And in fact, this had a lot to do with sort of the opening that Milton Friedman and his economics stepped into because they had a way of trying to explain this that others did not. What else? And those are not actually the kinds of things that Harvey is trying to get to here. The economic threat, yes, stagflation was part of that. But the political threat, what's the political threat to ruling elites in the 1970s? And perhaps the 1960s are a better period in which to try to summon these memories. What was going on in the United States in the 1960s? Come on, we're at Berkeley. We've got to have some answers to these questions. Please. Okay. Revolutions, or at least talk about revolutions. Massive movements of students and workers. The civil rights movement. The student social democrat, democratic socialists of America, that kind of thing, right? Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. There were widespread talk, not just in the United States, but in other places as well. I mean, the students in Paris, along with a lot of workers, took over Paris for the better part of a couple months in 1968, demanding radical change in education, in the economy, in the government. There was a sense that labor unions, student organizations, minority groups were mobilized and active and demanding change, and in many cases demanding change that they themselves described as revolution that would potentially threaten the established interests, be they white people, be they rich people, be they corporations, be they political parties. These are the kinds of threats that Harvey is suggesting were looming large in the minds of the establishment elites, people sitting on boards of corporations, people sitting in political offices. They were scared. And there were economic threats. And Harvey provides a variety of ways of illustrating this. So here's figure 1.1, the economic crisis of the 1970s, inflation and unemployment in the US and Europe, 1960 to 1987. Inflation rate here, unemployment rate here. Europe is the dots, the US is the solid line. And you can see a spike in the inflation rate up to 8% in the US, up to almost 12% in Europe, coinciding with a spike in unemployment. Unemployment continuing to rise even as inflation was also up. And again, I mean, by the end, you see that the two have diverged again. Inflation has dropped, unemployment has not. So the previous relationship has been restored. But for a period of time there in the 70s, they were behaving oddly. Figure 1.2, the wealth crash of the 1970s. Share of assets held by the top 1% of the US population, 1922 to 1998. So you take the richest 1% of the population of the US and you ask, what proportion of the wealth in the nation as a whole do these people own? And you can see that in the 1920s, it was better than 40%. It climbed to almost 50%. And then it began a decline. And it declined significantly during World War II. It went back up somewhat. And then it plummeted to 25% or less in the 1970s. How does this kind of thing happen? How could it be that the richest 1% have lost half of their wealth relative to the nation as a whole between 1930 and 1975? What does it take to redistribute wealth like that? Any ideas? Yeah. Inflation is one way to do it. Inflation is definitely one way to do it. Why? If you have $10 million in the bank, why is inflation a bad thing? Yeah. It devalues what you have. Right? The definition of inflation is that prices go up. The other way of expressing that, another way of saying the same thing, is that the value of your money goes down. What you can buy with your money declines. If inflation is high, your $10 million in the bank is essentially losing its value with every passing day. It will buy less and less and less and less. Unless you have interest rates that go up. Yes? Everyone's money becomes less valued. Exactly. Inflation is bad if you have $10 million in the bank. Inflation is even worse if you only have $10,000 in the bank. So wouldn't that not change the relative share of different people? You're right. It doesn't. So what else has to happen? How else might this have happened? Yeah?
Unions, maybe?
Unions could have an effect on this by demanding higher wages for workers, which might reduce profits for companies and in turn reduce things like dividends for the people who own shares in those companies. That's one way it can happen, yes? Taxes! There you go. That's one really effective way to redistribute wealth. Right? You can tax income. What were the income tax rates on the wealthiest 1% of the country after the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration? Anybody know? What was the very highest income tax bracket in the United States, beginning roughly here and continuing until roughly here? Anybody know? Yeah. 90%. If you were in the top income bracket, 90% of what you made went back to the federal government as income taxes. What's the top rate now? Anybody know? 36. 36. I think that's right. It might be 32, but it's in that ballpark. It's much lower than it was. Estate taxes are another example, right? Estate taxes go straight at wealth rather than just income. You die, you have $10 million in the bank. Can you just give it to your children? Or do you have to pay some taxes first? Well, if there is a high estate tax rate, and it is actually still, I think it's 55% for the largest estates. So you might give half or more of your estate to the government before you can give the rest to your children. These are some of the policies that made this change happen. The Volcker shock, movements in the real rate of interest, U.S. and France, 1960 to 2001. What's the real rate of interest? Anybody know? Well, what's nominal interest? We need some econ majors in the room. No econ majors in the room? You go to the bank, you put a bunch of money in the bank, and you ask them what's the interest rate. And these days they tell you it's 0.1% or something like that, right? In the past, it might have been 3% or even maybe 4 or 5%. And that's the amount of interest they pay you for letting them hold your money. Of course, they don't just hold your money. They actually play with it. They use it. The money you give them is money that they can then turn around and lend to people at interest. And they can charge interest on those loans. And they make money from that interest. Well, the idea is that if you lent them the money, you deserve some cut of what they can make with that money. And that's why they pay you interest. But that's just the nominal rate. The real rate of interest is the nominal rate minus inflation. The inflation rate is a measure of how your money is losing value over time. So if you put $10 million in the bank and they're paying you 3% interest, but the inflation rate is also 3%, at the end of some period of time, like a year, you'll have more money in nominal terms, but it will be worth the same amount as it was when you started. This climb here, or this drop, I'm sorry, here, in the mid-1970s, is negative real interest, which is to say inflation was higher than interest rates, which is to say that if you had $10 million in the bank, you might be making 4 or 5% in interest on it, but inflation was 7 or 8%. You were losing money with each passing second. Harvey pulls this out to emphasize how much of a threat this posed to people with large amounts of money, with large amounts of wealth. This was a phenomenon in which macroeconomic processes were essentially reducing the wealth of the people who owned capital simply with the passage of time. And you can imagine that this is not something that makes the people with a lot of wealth very happy. This is the economic threat that was faced in the 1970s by people with lots of money. You combine that with the political threat that they felt from people in the streets, the threat of communism, the Cold War, and you get the circumstances of the 1970s, which Harvey is suggesting gave rise to neoliberalism as a political economic philosophy and response to these circumstances. Are there any questions? Let's take a 5-minute break. Okay. So, and by the way, David Harvey gave a lecture last week at the conference in Washington, D.C., and he made the case that the current financial crisis, what we have seen in the last, say, year and a half, 2 years, he explained it. His analysis of the current financial crisis was as a consequence, it is a consequence of the changes that were made in the 1970s in response to this crisis. That what was done to sort of address the crisis of the 1970s set the pieces in place for the crisis that we've experienced in the last couple of years. One of the things he said about the 1970s was that labor was excessively strong relative to capital and in the eyes of capital, and that the 1970s and neoliberalism were a response to that strength of labor. In any case, going back to his treatment in his book from several years ago, we can interpret neoliberalization either as a utopian project to realize a theoretical design for the reorganization of international capitalism, or as a political project to reestablish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elites. The utopian part he's referring to is this faith in free markets to solve all problems, and even the faith that there is such a thing as a free market. He argues that the free market is actually a utopian idea insofar as every market, in order to operate, has got to have certain rules of the road, so to speak, particularly things like currencies, that are unavoidably about political processes, states, government, that kind of thing. To that extent, the idea of a free market somehow disconnected from political processes is utopian. But here he's going to focus on the political project of neoliberalism. He's going to suggest that the utopian project, because it's a utopian project, can never really be achieved. But the political project, he suggests, was quite successful. Neoliberalization has not been very effective in revitalizing global capital accumulation, he says, but it has succeeded remarkably well in restoring, or in some instances, as in Russia and China, creating the power of an economic elite. The theoretical utopianism of neoliberal argument has, I conclude, primarily worked as a system of justification and legitimation for whatever needed to be done to achieve this goal. So his analysis of global capitalism since the 1970s is that it hasn't really solved the problem of increasing accumulation itself, but it has achieved the goal of redistributing wealth back into the hands of an elite and undermining the relatively equitable distribution of wealth that was found circa 1973. And to illustrate this, he summons some data. The restoration of class power share in national income of the top 0.1% of the population, US, Britain, and France, 1913 to 1998. So now we're talking about 1/10 of 1% of the population. How much income does this select group receive? Share as a percentage of the entire national income. And you can see the United States is the solid dark dots, France is the triangles, United Kingdom is the circles. You can see that in prior to the Depression, the top 1/10 of 1% received about 10% of all national income. This declined steadily until by the end of World War II, it was a mere 2 to 4%. It continued to decline into the 1970s, down to just 1% in the United Kingdom, about 2% in the US and France. And you can see that after the mid-1980s, it begins to climb again. And the United States is particularly pronounced in this. It's back up to 6% by 1998. I'm not sure what the latest figures are, but I'm quite confident that they are, in fact, higher than that. So this is just a simple description or measurement of inequality in terms of income. Here we have pay of CEOs according to their rank in the hierarchy, the 10th, 50th, and 100th. So this is the pay rank of the 10 highest paid CEOs. This is a logarithmic scale. and you can see that the increase has been quite dramatic, and it's been the most dramatic at the very top. So the other average pay of 100 CEOs with higher remunerations, 1,000 here means 1,000 times the average salary. So if you look at the average salary in the U.S. economy as a whole, this log scale suggests that in 1975, the top 10 CEOs made about 50 times the average salary in the economy, but that by 2000, that was more than 1,000 times the average salary. The tax revolt of the upper class, U.S. tax rates for higher and lower brackets, 1913 to 2003. Here you can see highest bracket, lowest bracket. So this is the tax rate imposed on the wealthiest, the highest earners, tax rate imposed on the poorest, the people with the smallest incomes. And you can see that the rate goes up for everybody through after the Depression, or through the Depression and World War II, but it is, at this point in time, an enormous gap. So 1965, at the top rank, it's above 90%. Down at the lowest bracket, it's less than 20%. It has not gone down significantly here, but for the very wealthiest, it has gone down in enormous steps, only coming back up actually in the Clinton years, but still significantly lower than it was in the middle of the 20th century. Real wages and productivity in the U.S., 1960 to 2000. This is a measurement here of productivity of the economy as a whole. This is real wages, so adjusted for inflation, 1960 in dollars per hour. So real wages peaked in 1973, if you adjust for inflation, at $15.72 an hour. And since then, even as productivity has gone up, which in theory ought to enable a higher wage for everybody in the economy, the real wages have declined, again, only coming up slightly in the late Clinton years. They have stagnated since then. So Harvey summarizes neoliberalism, or coins a new term for what's going on in the present time, which he calls accumulation by dispossession. And here he's being inspired not only by events in Iraq, where that dispossession is actually achieved by military force, but events in places like Jamaica or Mexico or other places. We'll read more about this in Davis. Structural adjustment programs in which dispossession occurs by the devaluation of a currency, for example, or the dismantling of a state sector that provided secure, high-wage jobs to large numbers of people in fields like education or healthcare, that kind of thing. The dismantling of those things under the dictates of the World Trade Organization, the World Bank. Well, it's usually the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. He breaks this down into privatization and commodification, financialization, the management and manipulation of crises, and state redistributions. These are key components or arenas in which this accumulation by dispossession takes place. Okay, how much time have I got left? Like 5 minutes, 10 minutes? 7 minutes. Okay. I don't think I have time to spell out what each of these mean right now, but we can come back to them. Perhaps you can talk about them during a section in relation to the movies. These are key aspects of both neoliberalism and globalization, right? The freedom of capital to move across national boundaries and to operate anywhere it wishes in the world on essentially the same terms, or terms that are roughly equal. In theory, the World Trade Organization is about creating international trade rules that will be the same everywhere and that will enable competition to be unaffected by political considerations and to operate purely on a logic dictated by market price signals. Now I want to quickly talk about development, the third term in our trio for the lecture today. And this is, I really just want to get you to think about this term not simply as a kind of descriptor in which, well, everybody develops and everything somehow moves in the direction of fulfilling its destiny, so to speak, right? We talk about human development. childhood development, there's this notion that there's a path, there's a trajectory. And I want you to ask whether thinking about such a trajectory for economies as a whole or societies as a whole really makes sense, or what it takes to think that, what it would mean to think that. There's a huge sector in the world right now. Many of you may end up working in development. Development is a huge arena. Lots of money, lots of people, lots of things happen in the name of development. If you've been reading the newspapers, debates about dams in the Amazon in Brazil are described in terms of the need for Brazil to develop, right? The need to provide greater incomes, greater well-being, that kind of thing. Well, where does this term, this idea come from? We've hit this a little bit with respect to Bernstein already, right? It's an 18th century term in English, emerged with industrialization and various theories of human prehistory and civilizations. It's linked very tightly to the ideas in the 18th century that we were making progress in ways that had never been seen before. We were developing incredible new productive technologies. We were changing governments and creating the conditions in which progress would come to be more and more amazing than it ever had been before. Modern society in this picture was seen as kind of a culmination of history. Some people cast it as evolutionary progress by survival of the fittest, tapping into sort of social Darwinism or cultural Darwinism, right? Applied to both society and the economy. So it was about economic growth and technological innovation in production, but it was also about the associated cultural and social norms and institutions, things like the arts and education, science, knowledge, wealth, cities and architecture. This whole trajectory was summarized with the idea of development. It was broadly, and it is to this day, broadly understood in terms of health and well-being and social harmony as well as prosperity. I mean, there's a general recognition that when we talk about development, we're not only talking about making more and more and more money. We're also talking about providing better health care, providing more education, better education, generally somehow moving up in this implied hierarchy of civilization and development. So it's a mix of GDP or income per capita, infant mortality, life expectancy, public health, education, et cetera. If anyone wants to talk about the level of development of a country, they'll talk about income and GDP, but they'll also talk about literacy, infant mortality, life expectancy, that kind of thing. So in this framework, it's not just about exchange value in a Marxian framework. It's also about use value. And there is a strong analogy between the individual and society, the idea that societies somehow go through a period of birth, adolescence, growth, maturation. They then arrive at something that we think of as being the logical or natural succession from an earlier stage to a fully developed one. Here's a conventional model that's frequently used. You start with a society that's principally agricultural. As agricultural productivity increases, you get surpluses that can be poured into industrial development. Industry will in turn generate more surpluses, which can then be poured into human resources such as education, and eventually arrive at a society dominated by a service economy. This is a model that you will probably recognize from England, from the United States. It's the idea that this has happened in those places, and it must be a trajectory, or it can be assumed to be a trajectory that will happen in other places as well. And this is sort of what development means. Economic output per sector. This is a map depicting the relative shares of agricultural industry and services in different parts of the world. And these are constructed in ways to try to illustrate the various points along this trajectory that you can be. So red means more than half of the economy is about services, and you can see that that's true of virtually all of Europe, the United States, much of South America, Australia, Japan, South Africa, and other countries in Africa as well. But it's the green countries where the economy is still dominated by agriculture that we tend to think of as the least developed. Anyway, Last note, there is a risk of teleology in development, a risk of imposing a linear notion of progress on all societies as though they must all eventually follow this same trajectory and arrive at the same point. And that contains a number of assumptions that can be questioned and challenged. I think I'm out of time. We will see you on Thursday. Thank you.